It's September 8th, Ukraine Media Center Ukrinform continues its operation, and my name is Svetlana Chaparenko. In the same way, the Situational Press Center continues its operation to cover the situation in the temporarily occupied territories in the south and east of Ukraine in the context of pseudo-elections. The organizers of this event are the Center of National Resistance of the Special Operations Center and Ukraine Media Center Ukrinform. So we proceed to our second panel, and now we're presenting you the OSINT research about the collaborationists taking part in the elections, pseudo-elections in temporarily occupied territories. This study is being presented by Artem Starosek, CEO and founder of Molfar, the biggest OSINT community in Ukraine. Good afternoon, Mr. Artem. Good afternoon. So first of all, Mr. Artem, please tell us what is OSINT and how those researches are being done and how they help us to discover the collaborationists in temporarily occupied territories. So let me tell you a couple of words about myself. We started working in 2019. We started as a commercial organization. We were making investigations in open sources, like when somebody is hiring somebody, the organizations wanted to find out more about their potential employees to mitigate the risks. But now we cooperate with the Ukrainian journalists, with other OSINT communities, which support the Ukrainian resistance. So both in commercial sector and in volunteer community, we work using the same methods. We use three main methods of intelligence. It's OSINT, open sources, when we go to registers, social media, news, and to some open source software. Also, we use the satellite analytics. We buy the satellite images when we need to confirm something, and there is human, so-called the agent intelligence. Our people use some legends. They communicate with the occupiers in temporarily occupied territories to obtain some additional information. That's in short what we're doing. So let's proceed to your study, what it has demonstrated and how it was done in general. Well, generally when we do some studies about the collaborationists, we try to cover a lot of people to make sure our register is extensive, so that everyone can enter that register, enter the name there, and then find that some other person is collaborating with the occupiers. So now during this presentation we will tell you about only 4 people who have high offices and they nominate in the temporarily occupied territories. So we want to make sure this information becomes public and everyone can see that. So talking about it in a little bit more detail, the information is quite brief, but generally we usually study the past of those people, and in their dossiers we can see that they were not quite successful in the past. There was something that they can get caught by. First, for example, we see that Vitaly Ihor, he had a pro-Russian sentiment for a long time, and there is Tamerlan Selekov in Kherson. We may see that he had loans, he had problems with the money, and he subscribed to a number of escort service personnel in Telegram. So this is what the Russian special services use to get them engaged. Then there is a woman, Yevgenia Kuzmenko, and she made a lot of statements online that she supported Russian Federation, that Russian or Georgian strip is good. Or, for example, Alexander Khlustov, he also, just like the previous man in our study, he is subscribed to different interesting publics in Telegram. He's subscribed to pro-Russian publics, and he also had problems with money. So the main message is that those people not always make that decision voluntarily. There is something that holds them, and Russians, they don't have any high matter in their heads, so to say. They just do some stupid things that can be used against them. So this is why that's probably the main conclusion why those elections cannot be considered legitimate. Thank you. But why this OSINT study is useful, how it can be used to bring those people to liability or to maybe create some leads to other people who can be brought to criminal liability, how it can be used generally? Well, it's a part of a strategic work. We have a register in our website, so we made publications about the collaborationists in Kherson region, in Zaporizhia region. There is a list of FSB servicemen, FSB or other propaganda personnel. So as we put together the list of those people, we hand them over to Ukrainian special services like Security Service of Ukraine or Main Directorate of Intelligence. So we give them those lists the earliest possible so they can process it the soonest possible, and we try not to create any obstacles in their work. Then as we get confirmations and as they are processed by Ukrainian special services, we publish those lists first for those people to see their names in those lists so that they have fear, that everybody knows that their crimes are documented and that those documents are not going anywhere. Then in the Telegram publics there is a broad community of the people which have different interests, so they send something to their people, they make calls to them, and they also take loans in their name. Also, there is a lot of people subscribed to our publics who are involved in development of sanctions, so we hand over those lists to them and they can ban or block the accounts of such persons, or they, for example, can create obstacles in extension of visas to such people. So those are the main goals that we pursue. Do you have information for what number of people such sanction bans have worked already? Have they been brought to liability by the law enforcement agencies already? Well, we were posting the list of FSB service persons. There were like thousands of FSB servicemen. We handed over those lists to the crypto exchanges and their accounts. About 30 accounts were banned. So let's proceed to Q&A. Our dear journalists, do you have any questions regarding the collaborationists whose activities were exposed?
Yeah, Chris Sampson, National Security Media. Who is it that does the OSINT work? Is it all government-controlled or intelligence agency, or do you have civilians who are involved? And if so, how do you guarantee the quality of the data?
We have a team of 60 people, and they're working like around 5 years already in our business, and we mostly use them for like final job. And also we have a list of volunteers who are working for us, and they helping us on the internal stage, and they like gathering big amount of data, and then my internal analysts who working full time, they checking this data, and then we providing this. And as for quality assurance, we usually working on one task. It's usually working 2 persons, one which have like a small experience, and second person who have bigger experience like a manager, and they cross-check each other. And also between the scenes we also have a human intelligence. For example, we see in a post in they've contacted this person is collaboration. It was involved in collaboration activity, but it could be posted by anyone, and we don't know for sure that it's his profile. And we also calling the people who know this person, for example, pretending to be Russian and asking about this person. For example, will he work on the election? And he says, and yes, he was working. So it's like, it's triple check.
Дякую. Чи є ще запитання?
Thank you. Do we have any more questions? Olena Chernikova, Ukraine TV channel. How did the number of collaborationists have changed, and how the methods of buying them have changed? Do you have any feedback about the results of your work in the temporarily occupied territories from the Ukrainians who wait for the return of Ukrainian control on those territories? Well, I cannot tell you the changes because we were usually studying different regions. For example, in Zaporizhia we posted 300 people, and the same thing was happening in Kherson. We were telling that those territories are about to be liberated soon, and now that we are gathering information about the elections, we don't have a reference point to compare that number with. But about the methods of buying them, we also, apart from collaboration, we also use different we also study different other people, you know, like people that they had other some debts or some financial problems. They were grafted, and this is how they are being promoted and become famous. So about our work, Roskomnadzor banned our website. They don't like what we do. And there was another story when we got a call after the publication of those lists where the people were asked to be removed from those lists. And we were trying to get some confirmation from them that they are already in Ukrainian-controlled territories. They were sending us some receipts, and we were finding out those were receipts from the internet, just from the internet. And then we've seen that there was an intense traffic coming from Russian Federation. And we see that people enter from Moscow region and they're Googling the name of an FSB serviceman, and there was a correlation between that name, for example, and their IP addresses. So they were basically checking on themselves or checking on each other. Thank you very much. Do we have any more questions?
You may have said this at the beginning. Do you have an approximation of how many people have been logged into this database, a general number?
Sorry, which one database?
Of potential collaborators. Is there a rough number of how many are currently being observed or have been entered in the database?
As for Zaporizhia, there was like around 250 people. As for Kherson, there was like 300. So I think it's like it was half year ago, and probably right now number is slightly bigger because Russian is still there and they like trying to influence these people. But I think it's around like 300 to 500 per one region.
Ще є запитання?
Yeah, thank you. Very interesting. I'm Aaro Ylitalo from the EU delegation. I would like to ask if you store the sources of your information, like if you say that certain person worked in this area of work, do you have somewhere the source for that you are able to find?
Usually it was first we usually have like a list of government employees, which was before the occupation, and using this we going through, for example, databases, and we find in social networks of these people, and we see that probably there is like photos of their collaborating activity, like photos with Russian some embroidery. And also we have some Telegram bots which could check like Telegram profiles of people, and we see in groups on which they subscribe it, and usually they subscribe it like on pro-Russian groups. And sometimes we see in, like photos from like some social activities by Russian government on these territories, and we see people on the photos that they are like attending these events. It's from those in part, and from the human intelligence, it's usually we trying to influence someone on these territories. For example, we using a legend, we pretending to be like a Russian journalist, or we pretending to be a Russian employee of the FSB, and we asking questions about people, and they give us information about the person who we put in the database.
But I meant it. do you store or archive the photos that you find in open sources if you need to check something?
Yeah, sure. We're using software. It's called Hunchly, and it's on everyone's laptop in my team. And when they click any link, it's like saving all the data internally on their desktop, and also they archive on the archive.org. And also, when they finish investigation, we put in on like our internal server this data for later use.
Від нас є ще запитання?
We have more questions. Hanna Chernova, BBC, you've mentioned that you hand over the information to special services of Ukraine. Do you know about any measures that have been taken against the officials of the occupational administrations? Well, we're not being given any feedback, but we can see the results on the news. So basically we look for that feedback in the news, and for what I understand you find it, yes, on a periodic basis. Any more questions, dear colleagues? Well, now that we don't have any more questions, Mr. Artem, thank you very much. We thank you for the invitation. We have 30 minutes for a coffee break. Everybody is invited for a coffee break. The next panel will be at 1400. We will talk about the humanitarian situation in temporarily occupied territories. Stay tuned. Ukraine Media Center Ukraine Forum continues its operation. My mic just doesn't work. We can provide it with ours. 1, 2. It's September 8th. Ukraine Media Center Ukraine Forum continues its operation. My name is Svetlana Cheparenko, and we continue our situational press center to cover the events in the temporarily occupied territories of east and south of Ukraine in the context of pseudo-elections held by the occupiers. The organizers of this event are Ukraine Media Center Ukraine Forum and the Center of National Resistance of the Special Operations Forces. The event is going on within the framework of main discussion platform Brain Hub, and we proceed to the third panel of our event. And its topic is humanitarian situation in temporarily occupied territories in compliance with the standards of international humanitarian law by the occupiers. The participants of our discussion today are Dmytro Lubinets, the Commissioner of the Parliament of Ukraine for Human Rights, Oleg Nikolenko, the spokesperson for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Aaro Ylitalo, political officer of the Representative Office of European Union in Ukraine, Alexandra Romantsova, executive director of Center for Civil Freedoms, and Ivan Fedorov, the mayor of Melitopol. So, dear colleagues, let's start with the general things. What is the humanitarian situation in temporarily occupied territories? What's going on with the medicine, education? Some basic rights, something that are people entitled to in the civilized world, and what do occupiers do to make sure that our citizens, our Ukrainians, don't have access to all those benefits? Well, if my colleagues allow me, I will start. The situation in general has not changed since the moment of occupation of any town or city in Ukraine. The Russian military continue creating military government office. They established the torture chambers. The next stage is the restriction of rights to movement, because they create the filtration system, and if you want just to leave your village or town, you have to go to the military government office to get a so-called permit, a paper that is being issued to a citizen of Ukraine or the entire family should they want to leave. So we document the facts that during the so-called screening procedures, the members of the families are being segregated, the males and females are being held separately, as well as the kids. They are being asked questions, and then their answers are compared. One of such questions that the occupational government asks our citizens is whether they were seen in Ukrainian songs at homes, whether they were sporting the Ukrainian banner, whether they were using Ukrainian national symbols. And it's clear, if the citizens of Ukraine were living in Ukraine, it's clear that they were singing Ukrainian songs, including the Ukrainian anthem. And we have documented facts that only based on such accusations, people were not only detained but put to prisons. Then the children were given away to their relatives if such relatives were found, and if they were not found, the children were sent to Donetsk. We have such documented facts in Donetsk region, in the children's detention site, and then the groups of such children were deported to Russian Federation. As to the right to education, one of the tasks set for the military government offices is the relaunch of curriculum process exclusively under the Russian curriculum. So-called first lesson is always a lesson of history that starts with talks that Ukraine never existed, Ukrainian language never existed, and you as a children are supposed to understand that you were always Russians, your native language is Russian, so rejoice Rejoice about being able to identify yourselves as Russians. Children are being used for propaganda activities. For example, Russian textbooks are being brought and children are supposed to meet them with the Russian flags in their hands and to tell the journalists how excited are they about the arrival of so-called humanitarian caravans. Another phase is passportization, and we can give a number of examples of forced passportization, but generally the system is built in such a way that either you get a Russian passport or you're restricted in all of your rights. You're not getting anything. You cannot get employed. You cannot leave. You can get deprived of your property. You can get deprived of your business. Or otherwise you live and you live exclusively for Russian Federation, or you get a passport. And the final stage is mobilization. All the men are being registered with the enlistment offices, not only males but also females that fall under so-called military professions. First of all, the medics, they are interested in medics most of all, and the elections. The last example that I want to give you today, I was told this story by the people who were the direct targets of influence of Russian military. They are a married couple of an old age who never addressed any of the Russian government authorities. So the Russian military came to their home nearby where the representatives of so-called elections committee, and as they walked out, those guys produced 2 Russian passports to be issued to them. Once again, I want to emphasize that they never addressed any occupational authorities to obtain a Russian passport. So it was so bold, so direct and blunt, like, here you go, here are your Russian passports, you're citizens of Russian Federation now, and if you're not happy about that, you're going with the military, you're going to the enlistment office. And then they were approached with the demand to vote right away. And one of the Russian military, he says, like, you understand whom to vote for? He pointed his finger, it was Единая Россия, the Russia United, and then he walked behind their backs to make sure that married couple voted correctly. They've taken away the bulletins and left. So that's one of the brightest examples that demonstrates the procedure of issue of Russian passports in temporarily occupied territories and the process of elections as it is. So I personally call this process as a circus on a barbed wire. It's just a picture for some foreign partners to create the conditions to continue the implementation of the peaceful initiatives that keep emerging on and on. And unfortunately, what I'm observing is that those initiatives are aimed at pressure on the Ukrainian side. And the last example is the statement by the president of Turkey, who said that Ukraine should act softer on re-establishment of the grain corridor. I'm not going to list all of the similar initiatives. When someone comes to Ukraine, or we are being addressed with any signals, but those signals are like, you as Ukraine are supposed to finally realize that you're supposed to sit at some negotiations table with the mediators and somehow end this war. And we all clearly realize in what way Russian Federation wants us to end this war by signing and rejecting all of our claims of the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. That's in brief about the situation from our institution. Thank you for invitation. I think that the Mr. Commissioner for Human Rights had a very comprehensive address, and I just want to add a couple of things. What's going on in my native city is the real genocide, because as the enemy arrives to us, their goal is to kill Ukraine and Ukrainity with our national identity, and there is a number of iterations how they were doing it. First, they were trying to make an agreement with our citizens about the support. Then they were trying to intimidate them. We see a lot of people were detained and imprisoned during the last summer. So after they failed in intimidation, they started pushing them out from the occupied territories and bringing their citizens from different regions of Russian Federation. This is exactly why they're trying to change the genotype of our cities, of our regions, by pushing out our local population. And as an example of that, a bright illustration of that is what's going on during these fake elections. They're trying to organize, to explain to their citizens of Russian Federation and international community that there is some support. It's the Yedina Rossiya party being on ballots in Melitopol. So 8 out of 26 nominees are the citizens of Siberia, Altai, and Dagestan. It says that they were not able to find the necessary number of reliable traitors, those whom they could nominate, and then they were not able to find some people who could nominate for the city council offices. What's going on with the social sphere, something that you asked us about. What's going on with our hospitals? Today, according to the unverified, unconfirmed information, the deficit of the doctors in Zaporizhia region is at least 3,000, which means that immense number of doctors have left. Many of the doctors who remained in temporary occupation don't agree to cooperate with the enemy, and I'm not aware of a single fact about any doctor who have agreed to cooperate in the military hospitals, but it reflects on our population who cannot obtain necessary medical services. Well, Mr. Oleg, we understand that the elections are fake. What's going on in occupied territories is a complete surrealism, but from the perspective of international humanitarian law, what are the standards they violate by those so-called elections? Well, good afternoon, everybody. Before I start answering your question, I would like to make a couple of comments. What Mr. Dmytro has just said, that Ukraine is being bent to make some concessions, and we clearly state that we're not going to agree anything that contemplates restriction of territorial integrity of Ukraine, and any concessions to Russia are unacceptable, including the reestablishment of the Black Sea Grain Initiative and what's going on in the media about different proposals submitted by different parties. The position of Ukraine is quite clear and strict. We don't support any sanctions lifting. Regarding the sanctions imposed against Russia, Russia had no right to withdraw from the grain initiatives, and if we won't be able to agree on re-establishing this initiative, we will develop new routes for exporting our grain, and we will work with our international partners in this area. As to the international humanitarian law and illegal elections, those elections, they are in contradiction with both Ukrainian legislation and the standards of international humanitarian law, including the Statute of the United Nations, because it's the territory of Ukraine, and Ukrainian legislation is in effect in Ukraine. We know that this topic of fake elections is no news. We remember back in March last year, back in March 2014, Russia performed the illegal referendum in Crimea, and they continue doing that in other temporarily occupied territories. Ukraine has developed a mechanism to react to such things happening. Illegal elections were reflected in the resolutions of the General Assembly of the United Nations, which clearly stated that those elections were illegal. They do not result in any legal consequences, and they don't change the status of the temporarily occupied territories, which are in fact Ukrainian. In the same way, this time Ukraine initiates the inclusion of the fact of the illegal elections in the official documents of the United Nations organization. I mean the resolutions that are being adopted in the end of the year, which cover the situation in Crimea and temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. Moreover, we think that these topics should not disappear from the radars of international community, and this is why Ukraine, in cooperation with the United States, initiated the urgent meeting of the United Nations Security Council, which will be dedicated to the topic of illegal elections in temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. And at the same time, the ministry works on making sure that the persons involved in organization of pseudo-elections are being brought to liability, and we initiate the additional sanctions on persons involved in this illegal elections process. Also, I would like to add that this topic may be not so intensely discussed in the Western countries now, but we should continue talking about that, about the legitimacy of the Russian legal system in general, because organizing illegal elections in the occupied territories, according to the logic of Russia, some of the representatives are supposed to become a part of the federal authorities of Russian Federation, specifically the Senate. But we have to say that if it's a result of the illegal activities, is the Russian legal system legit in general? This is something that we try to explain to our international partners. Mr. Aaro, the question is for you. What is the
elections on these temporarily occupied territories, and is the European Union working on adding collaborations to the sanction list, or maybe not only collaborations, maybe only also journalists, bloggers who support all this process?
Дякую. Мені розмовляти англійською. So, thank you first of all very much for the information, and I would also like to thank all the Ukrainian officials and NGOs who share this information from the occupied areas with us. And regarding the sham election, the EU's position is very clear. It's illegal, it's a violation of international law, including UN Charter and Ukraine's territorial integrity. EU has formally communicated this on a statement already in June, after the Russian Central Election Commission announced the elections. And further, there was a EU External Action Service spokesperson's tweet last week when the voting started, and there may be also further communications coming. As regards to sanctions, this will obviously trigger new discussions on sanctions, but I'm not in the position to promise anything or say anything exactly at this point. These discussions might take some time, and the agreement of all member states is needed. Maybe I'll also comment Mr. Lubinets and Mr. Nikolenko's word on possible peace negotiations. EU's position remains very clear there also. It is Ukraine's decision to decide when they are ready, if they are ready to launch peace negotiations, and we strongly support President Zelensky's 10-point peace formula, which should be the basis for any discussions like that.
Thank you. Pani Alexandra,
Alexander, the Center for Freedoms has got an important award for documenting Russia's crimes. So these pseudo-elections is just one of the many crimes committed by the Russian Federation. Are you planning to document other things as well? And what is the information you were able to collect so far? Thank you. Indeed, the Center for Civic Freedoms is right now documenting the crimes within the initiative Tribunal for Putin. We are doing this together with the Ukrainian Helsinki Union and many other organizations. There are over 20 organizations working together, and there are thousands of crimes we have documented. We started this documenting process since 2013, and we need to clearly understand that all the practice that we are having there, all those tortures, and separation of families, etc. All of this started back in 2013. Illegal mobilization, which is a war crime for the occupying country, is something that started in the Crimea much earlier than in 2022. And we are seeing it everywhere, in every land where Russia holds control. We can see that Russia is committing numerous more crimes, imprisoning civilians, and it's something entirely new for us, and many people even have doubts on how to call this crime. De facto, they are victims of enforced and violent incarceration. Among those people are local self-government members, volunteers, journalists, regular citizens that lived their regular lives, and suddenly Russia defined for them a new country that should take care of them. Take care means committing war crimes. So this campaign that we started, Prisoner's Voice, since 2013, and Alex Sentsov was one of the speakers there. We have prepared a new edition of the brochure. There are basically representatives of every profession, a priest, a plumber, a citizen of Spain. Well, Russia is making yet another Bucha every day. We need to explain to the international community that that was not a one-time tragedy. The tragedy is a long-term occupation of those territories. Every time we are visiting a village that was under occupation for a month, just one conversation with local citizens gives us information of 20 to 30 cases of potential war crimes, which means every day of the enemy occupation brings lots of work for the International Criminal Court, and they need to work to investigate those crimes. And of course we will be documenting all that until every victim and every survivor gets the justice they deserve. We know that no international structure right now can bring the country to accountability for the crime of aggression, and Ukraine is right now working to establish such a structure. And right now the civil society organizations are collecting information, and hopefully they will be able to initiate at least 20 to 30 cases to investigate the cases of those who given the orders, but those who implemented them are numerous. There are thousands of people, and Ukraine needs to establish a mechanism for the courts to be able to process all of those cases. And more importantly, we have actual living people imprisoned right now. Those imprisoned by the Russian Federation, and we are finding them miraculously, sometimes thanks to volunteers working on those territories. And once we learn about such a person, we learned that these people are staying there without any status. Russia gives them numbers, so according to their legislation, they cannot move them between places as living people, so they are moving them as furniture. So an international community doesn't know how to respond to this because this is unprecedented. So Ukraine has some leadership position in this, and we need to help international humanitarian law evolution so that all those examples of crimes demonstrated by the Russian Federation right now do not become the norm for other semi-totalitarian countries. It's very important for us to do this for us and our Ukrainian survivors, but also for the international community at large. These elections are one of the examples how Russia wants to discredit important democratic mechanisms. So previously it tried to use the so-called referendums, and we spent 8 years proving that the thing that was happening in the Crimea was not even a representative social survey. And the same thing is that they are trying to do right now. Elections are a democratic mechanism to help people agree on how they want to live, but this is impossible without the freedom of speech, without access to active and passive electoral right. And this is impossible there. This is something that we need to share with the international community, UN, and I welcome such initiatives as presentations at the UN Security Council. Also, there will be a high-level meeting in New York quite soon. There will be an OSCE forum in Warsaw, and it's been 13 days since every day there was a side event to share the information on this. So join in, work with us. We need to liberate everyone who is right now imprisoned by the Russian Federation, those who are waiting for Ukraine to prevail and bring back all its people. Thank you. And now I'm going to give the floor to our journalists. I'm sure they will have some questions. Hello, I'm Maria Hanchar from Ukraine Forum. My question goes to Mr. Lubinets. We heard from Pavlo Lysansky that Russians wanted to establish a network of occupation prisons for Ukrainians. Do you know anything about that? What are the approximate numbers who are kept there? Thank you for your question. Well, I cannot say that we are noticing that the establishment of any migration camps. Speaking of the system of filtration camps, yes, the system of established place of torture, yes, we are aware of that, and we are discovering new such places with every coming day. Russians are basically using any premises where the citizens of Ukraine can be kept. This can be some cellar with no conditions, which is cold and dark and moist. There can be some garage or whatever. We had such examples in the liberated territory of Kharkiv region. We discovered a 2 square meter attachment to a building with just a small holes for the access of the air, and we were told that it was used to keep 6 people inside. We don't even understand how those 6 people could fit in, but the cynicism of Russians is boundless, and we are learning about new facets of it every day. As for this new system of camps of prisons, I'm not ready to confirm that, but yes, indeed, we are discovering new locations where Ukrainian citizens are detained right now or were detained before. Most of the time, these detainees are civilian, and I do agree that we as a government need to share this story, specifically informing the international community on the situation with civilian prisoners. We don't even know the scope of this tragedy. The official numbers are somewhere around 25,000, and quite often the relatives of those imprisoned by the Russians, they are in the temporarily occupied territories, and they are just afraid to inform the Ukrainian government bodies about the things that had happened. So we can also inform about people coming back from there. So for comparison, we have a situation with children, which we are bringing back. We have prisoners of war that we are bringing back. We have political prisoners that we are bringing back. And so civilians are the most difficult category, because there is no international system, unlike with the prisoners of war. And just informing the international community, just like in the situation with the children, yes, we can do that, but let's be clear, the entire international community responded to the situation with Ukrainian children only after the 2 arrest orders issued by ICC from Mr. Putin and Ms. Belova. Before that, since 2014, we were telling everyone that Russians were deporting Ukrainian children, and the first so-called humanitarian program for adoption, the Train of Hope, was launched on the temporarily occupied territory of the Crimea. Russians were coming, picking Ukrainian kids, adopting, and going back to the territory of the Russian Federation. What was the world's response? Well, deep concern, probably. But the real response came after ICC orders, and this is some homework to do about civilian detainees as well. Okay, let ICC issue the order for Putin or Shoigu or whatever. I don't know, thousands of Russians are taking part in those crimes of war. And maybe after that we will see some change, and our civilian detainees will be also on the agenda. So we are today discussing the violation of the international humanitarian law by the Russian Federation. There is a separate situation in Olenivka where a separate crime of war happened with hundreds of people killed. So we demand the response to happen. We speak every day about deportation of the Ukrainian children, and I'm sure that there are no people left who could actually fail to see signs of wartime genocide in those actions. And despite all the work we are doing, despite the legal documenting of those facts, even when the situation with the Ukrainian kids, which is so visibly showing signs of genocide, when we are watching the reaction of the international community time and again, recently there was the head of UN's mission for documenting crimes. They are saying we do not see crimes of genocide. We don't see signs of it. What else do we need to do for the world to finally see what Russia is doing here in the territory of Ukraine? It is genocide. If you permit, I'll add, most probably what you are mentioning are the centers for temporary detention of citizens, because Russia is integrating the occupied territories into their structures, and this creates additional risks for people in the occupied territories. This situation was also observed in the Crimea. Let's say the Crimean Tatar families coming back from Uzbekistan, and let's say one person was a citizen of Ukraine, another family member was the citizen of Uzbekistan married to a citizen of Ukraine. So in this case, Ukraine was always receiving those people quite well, but Russia usually chose the politics of deportation. So there can be this other group of people for illegal deportation, because Russia believes these are the people illegally staying on their territory, quote unquote. This will be a new group of discriminated people, discriminated by the occupational government. Next question, please. I am Dmytro Durnev, and I have two questions to Dmytro Lubinets. Alexandra mentioned that they have some volunteers monitoring situation in the occupied territories. Does your office have such volunteers?
And the second channel, from your Telegram channel, I'm seeing that you exercise the monitoring mission in the territory of Kiev-Pechersk-Lavra Reserve. Are there any violations of freedom of movement or any other freedoms? Thank you. So, talking about the first question, we have no volunteers in Russian Federation and temporarily occupied territories. Let's put it like that. We have mechanisms to obtain information from temporarily occupied territory of Ukraine on a daily basis. As to the situation with the Lavra, it's not quite our format of meeting, but if there is a question, I'll give you a small comment. I got an appeal from a lawyer who defends the rights of the adherents who stay 24/7 in Kiev-Pechersk-Lavra in the National Reserve. My representative exercised a monitoring visit. We inspected two facilities, 57 and 58. One had 4 people, another one had 8 people, so we identified no restriction of movement. Nobody detains them there, no one prohibits them to leave that territory, nobody bans the monks entering or exiting, bringing food or medicines there. So we detected that there was many food, some of it was already cooked. Special attention was paid in that appeal that there was no water and the people are being starved. In our presence, the food was there. We didn't identify any signs of exhaustion. That's a preliminary opinion. I'm dealing with this personally, but on the surface, we have not seen any violations of the rights of adherents. I keep emphasizing that if anybody tells me about the violation of anybody's rights, including the rights of religious adherents, we react right away. And if the representatives of our government violate some laws, we will document that. If there are unverified data in the documents, we will expose such facts. Dear colleagues, more questions, but please stay within the framework of our discussion. If you have some questions beyond that, let's ask them later. There will be a question from a foreign journalist. There is a...
It's a national security media. In the occupied territories where we've had torture locations like the police stations, etc., is it predominantly FSB who's running those, or do you have a sense of strata of who's conducting those operations? Because when I've questioned people who've been through it, whether they be Ukrainians, Americans, Brits, the FSB is often involved. So can you give us some clarification on that, Diakono?
So I will answer by English for you. FSB usually take a part in different operation at the occupied territory from 2013. If we will speak about such place of torture, like Ylitalo, maybe you heard about this big center of torturing. So local authorities from LPR, DPR even don't have a permission go inside. So it's just to continue all what happened with same tradition which they create during the previous 8 years before invasion. They just multiply it all the occupied territory. Перепрошую, колеги, повторю українською, що, як правило, ФСБ керує такими операціями, це починається ще...
Well, I'll switch to Ukrainians. Dear colleagues, this tradition was initiated back in 2014 in such big centers where people were tortured. And one of the examples of such torture chambers is isolation, изоляция. But as of the year 2016, we counted 86 such places.
86 illegal places of detention at the occupied territory of Donbass. So it's really usual practice, and FSB involved in this totally.
Я додам.
I will add, in the beginning of occupation of Melitopol, two groups were separated and they were acting independently of Russian authorities. One was in charge of military operations. Well, since Melitopol was occupied within a couple of days, the military left within a couple of days, and then FSB switched to managing this operation. They were in charge of political, economic activities in the occupied city. Why am I so sure saying that? Because it was my personal pain, and it was important for me to find the people who were directly coming to our executive committee during the occupation, who were given orders to imprison people. And after 1.5 years of occupation, we know clearly the names of the FSB agents, the 5th department, who were directly in charge of organization of fake authorities in Zaporizhia region, in Melitopol. So that's the organization structure of 5th department of FSB. Thank you. Next question. I will add just very briefly that you have to realize that everything related to support of the occupational authorities, FSB is in charge of all those processes. Even if you don't see that, anyway, everything is managed by the agents, officers of the FSB. I'm having two questions, one to Mr. Fedorov. So who is nominating in those elections? Which fraction of people, which fraction of the nominees are those imported from Ukraine, or sorry, from Russia? What is the percentage of such people? It's the first question, and the next one is to follow. Well, we did such a job. We tried to identify all the persons nominating to some occupational authorities. The enemy helped us by making those lists public. Thus, they supported the work of our law enforcement agencies to make sure that all those scams are being brought to liability. So there are 4 parties nominating: Fair Russia, Russia United, LDPR, and just Russia. So they have the right to agitate for one party, is Russia United. If we check out the list of all the candidates, 28 people out of 40 are from Siberia, Altai, Dagestan, and other parts of Russia. If we check out the list of LDPR, out of 16 nominees, 18 are from Siberia, Dagestan, and other parts of Russia. Furthermore, I'm sure that 100% of citizens are about to vote for the enemies. At least 80% will vote for Russia United, and other parties will share that rest 20%. And I'm sure that 90% of the future councils will be made up of people who come from abroad, to make sure that it's easier to manage them and they don't have any questions about how to vote. The local traitors will not be even able to become a part of those councils. Well, there are representatives of so-called collaborationists. Well, we know all the names like Balitsky, Danilchenko, and the rest, but those are the single examples. The rest of them are the Russians who came there. Another question is to Mr. Nikolenko. Today is a meeting of a Security Council. I think it's in vain to wait for something surprising there, but what do we want to see in the practical area? Well, I've already stated about the position of Ukraine, that the elections are illegal, they are in violation of United Nations statute, and the organizers should be imposed the new sanctions. The meeting will be devoted to this, and we expect that the elections will be condemned and the ways will be discussed of how to react to such processes in future. So we will use the tribune of the United Nations Security Council to bring this issue to international level, and we will use all the platforms and levers available to the diplomats to continue keeping this problem in focus. Thank you. Next question, Igor Bordyan, Army Inform. I have a question to Mr. Ihor Nikolenko. On September 9 and 10, there will be a meeting of Group of 9 in India. So should we expect for any declaration of condemnation of Russian Federation? Are there any initiatives undertaken by Ukraine to amend the international humanitarian law? Because as we witness, what was created after year 1945 just doesn't work. We see there is a huge amount of war crimes committed by Russians in Ukraine. So does the MFA come with any such initiatives? Any such initiatives? Well, we expect the participants to condemn Russian aggression, but as we know, the discussions about the final declaration are still in progress. We've heard the statement by the head representative of the United Nations, who says that the representatives of Russia, they banned the adoption of the final communique, but we are in constant contact with our partners, specifically with the United States, and this is what Secretary of State was talking about during his visit to Kiev. We expect some intense wording to be adopted that will condemn Russian aggression, but there might be some nuances. But as I have just said, the process is still underway. As to the international humanitarian law, Ms. Alexandra was talking about the civil prisoners. It's a huge problem, and this is the problem that is in the gray zone of the international humanitarian law, because the Geneva Convention contemplates the way we should act in case of prisoners, of military prisoners of war, but there are no clear mechanisms that are supposed to work for liberation of civil prisoners. So that's yet another sphere of international humanitarian law where we should undertake the initiative to change this situation. So we have tools, we have levers to free people like that. Thank you. Do we have any more questions? If we have no more questions, at 1500 we will have a unique opportunity to talk to people who survived the occupation. They will tell their real stories. And I want to thank our panelists for joining our discussion. Thank you.
It is the 8th of September, Ukraine Media Center at Current Forum, and we continue to cover the temporarily occupied territories situation in the context of the pseudo elections organized by the occupiers. This event is happening as a part of the Media Center Brain Hub discussion platform, and this is our final panel. We are going to speak with people who have left the temporarily occupied territories. So they will share their stories, and I will present our guests. It is Ostap, the speaker of Special Operation Forces, Sergei Sterkov, who has been through the first months of occupation of Kherson, and also Lyudmila Starkova, who has been through the entire occupation of Kherson. So let's give the floor to Ostap first. Yeah, thank you, dear colleagues. Thank you for staying here. Thank you for hearing, being ready to hear the things that are not trivial. You will hear about the actual occupation and life in the occupation. You will hear about the experience of civilians. Quite often we hear the stories told by officials. Some people do not trust those, but there are real people who know what repressions are, what pressure is. Lyudmila was hiding the Ukrainian flag she was hiding it in the soil, but she was not ready to part with it because it was something important. There are some people who were not ready to come here. We invited people from the deoccupied territories. Some people are just not ready for such conversations psychologically, and of course we cannot force people who have spent months in the cellar to take part in events like this current one. But I'm giving the floor back to Svetlana for the moderation, and I want you to hear what Russian world means today. Okay, let us start with Ihor. You have left the occupied territory of Melitopol. You have spent some time there, and you could see how our people are becoming collaborationists and how Russia is winning over them and getting them to support Russia. So partially these elections partially depend on the collaborationists. What was your experience? Hello, I'm Ihor Simonenko. I'm the advisor to the mayor of Melitopol since 7 a.m. February 24th, 2022. I was staying in Melitopol for about a month in the beginning of the occupation. After that, I left, and we created NGO Wings of Victory. We were evacuating people from the occupied territories of Melitopol and Kakhovka and Berdyansk and Khenichevsk and Kherson because, well, the crossing point was the same. We were able to evacuate over 1,000 people. For some time, we are still dealing with those occupied territories. So what exactly would you like to hear from me? Well, some of your memories of what was happening during the occupation, what was the behavior of the occupiers, and how they were trying to persuade the locals to join their ranks. Well, I met the occupiers at 7 p.m. In the border of the city. So there was a circular defense installed around the city. I saw those guys about 12 or 14 hours after the first strikes on Ukraine. And after that, well, there were battles in the city. Our guys have left to the locations where they currently are, and the city was under occupation since then. The army entered the city, and for a couple of weeks we didn't see FSB, but later they also came to the city, and the foundation of their work was the collaborationists, the so-called Balitsky group, the one who is the head of Zaporizhia region as a part of the Russian Federation. His team from the outset was building a network of collaborationists in the city. So basically, that's a popular technology that has been previously used in Chechnya and in Syria later. So that's a primary network that gets established at any territory occupied by the Russians. So they consist of the managers of the buildings, apartment buildings, who know all the residents. So they are the ones making the lists of untrustworthy people, those with the Ukrainian values, and also the former, well, the veterans of the anti-terroristic operation back then, also the local politicians, also, well, people like that were listed, and also they made the list of apartments that have been left behind by those who left. So these people were the first who contributed to the Russians' ability to seize the property of Ukrainians who left. So this was the Russian army or the Chechnya and Ossetia groups that arrived there. So usually that's the foundation of the network they establish in the occupied territories. Also, taxi drivers are a very important group for them. One needs to be loyal to the enemy to be able to work there. And being loyal means reporting on people, and they have established this practice really efficiently. So the person who reports on someone gets money for that. So it became business. These people want to feed their families, so they are reporting about the things they know, things they heard, and things they invented. And based on that, the police is traveling there, or some militia in the beginning, maybe some units of the so-called Donetsk National Republic. They are checking the facts behind those reports, and the same is happening with the taxi drivers and apartment building managers. Also, the education system is a very important component of that. So this is how education in the occupied territories is happening. By September 1st, 2022, the teachers who worked for schools, universities, colleges, etc., most of them refused to work with Russians, maybe somewhere between 85 and 90% refused. So they basically were ready to give everyone a job of a teacher, some janitor, maybe some person who has never had any experience of working with children. They were willing to work at school because they wanted to get money, and the occupiers are paying quite well. So this is how they were able to establish the education using these self-proclaimed teachers, and this is how they launched education. Well, they were not able to launch it in September last year, but it was launched somewhere in mid-October. So the main emphasis in their so-called education is propaganda and the deconstruction of the Ukrainian children's self-identification as Ukrainians. Also, the sports classes are being provided, where even larger amounts of propaganda are being delivered. Children are being told that they are Russians and they are taking part in competitions with the Crimea, Krasnodar, Chechnya. We frequently hear about certain groups leaving for participation in such competitions and coming back in about a month. So that's what is happening with children in the occupied territories. Well, yeah. That's basically it. Thank you for your story. The journalists will be able to ask their questions, and let's give the floor to Lyudmila. What has been your experience? Most probably everyone in this room knows Lyudmila from this story, how she was hiding the Ukrainian flag, which was a sign of patriotism in those difficult conditions. So you have been through the entire occupation of Kherson. You probably remember the so-called referendum. So my question is about this. How did the occupiers get ready for it, and what was this referendum all about? Yeah, I'm Lyudmila Starakova, a retired person, a regular resident of Kherson. It was a terrible dream for me. On March 1st, they were there in our city, and I saw them beside my windows. So probably for about 20 minutes I was watching them, and it seemed an hour. So this was a tension we experienced all the time. And I recalled a poem by a Ukrainian author who told that people are dark like the soil. Yeah, Russians wanted to show that they are somehow important in our region, and this is why they were organizing this referendum. But we also got ready for it because we wanted to skip it. And a couple of days before they started this referendum, people stopped leaving their apartments. You probably could see some footage of the enemy going door to door and people not opening the doors. So we lived in a separate family house, so we did not go outside in those days. We were given signs to each other through the windows. We just know that Russians brought in some people from the outside, and also some of the local collaborators were brought from one location to another to pretend they were voting. But, well, we know many of the local residents who voted in many different locations at a time. So that's how the referendum was organized. So we can say that locals were not supporting the occupiers' regime. No. I'm very proud of my city because our city resisted really seriously. It's difficult to put this into words. One should have seen that to live a life of pride for the residents of one city. Yeah, let's continue this conversation with Lyudmila's son, Sergei. He was apprehended by FSB. Yeah, a few more words about the referendum. So the first rumors about the upcoming referendum were there on the 13 days of the occupation. March 13th was the liberation day of Kherson, the day it was liberated from Nazi occupation in World War II, and this is when the rumors started about the upcoming referendum. At that time, there was a big rally, and I was taking part. This was our response of us as civil society. Again, these are memories for life. It was very scary, and we were there with the flags, and there were people with machine guns standing against us. So March 13th was the largest rally we had there. So we were traveling together. There was a 1 kilometer long flag. So we had a long line of people working with it, and then the enemy started shooting in the air. It was very scary, but the people kept on marching, telling the enemy that they are Nazi and they are not at home, and they need to go back. So these were a few words about referendum. I started volunteering on the 25th of February 2022, and I went there to a local government institution. There was a location where people were bringing whatever they had at home, some food, some protective vests, some clothes, because on Antonovsky Bridge there were some first battles, and we were collecting some items for the local combatants. So we were bringing whatever we had, and I was deeply touched by the story of one granny who was about 85 years old, and she brought 20 hryvnias and a piece of pig fat. That's whatever she had at home, and it has a very good picture of what people of Kherson are. On March 1st, the Russians entered the city, and our hub was closed down, and our other center became the cafe of my friends. We were feeding people because the stores were not operating in the city, and so there were lots of elderly people, low mobility groups, and we decided we would feed them. So we knew a lot of people in the restaurant business, and we started collecting the remaining food from them, and we were bringing food to people. That's what we continued to do for 3 weeks until March 19th. And then 30 FSB people came to our volunteer hub, and they entered the center. There were just me and 2 ladies there. So we were quite fortunate that most of our people were away, but we were also quite unfortunate because a neighboring room with us was the former office of the Right Sector organization, which has burned down to like 5 or 6 years ago. But we were detained as the members of the Right Sector. So our first response was the attempt to run away, but actually we had nowhere to go, and we just sat there and waited until they broke the doors. So we were deleting everything from our cell phones that could somehow discredit us. And they came there, just like it's shown in the movies. They aimed shotguns at us and lasers, etc. And it was so scary. So the girls were taken to another room, and I was undressed. I was wearing only my underwear, so they put on handcuffs on my hands. They did not like what I was telling, because I told them we were volunteers. I told them the truth, and then they aimed 15 guns at me and told me, okay, tell me the truth. And they were filming me all the time. And so they told me that I had to tell I was disapproval of the actions of the right sector, and they filmed me. But in their final video, they did not include me, because maybe I'm a bad actor, I don't know. So we were some of the first people detained by FSB in the city, so they were quite careful to us. I mean, they have beaten me up, they have almost killed me, they have taken away all our equipment and money, but this was still not as bad as for my other friends who were kept in the cellars. Some of the friends were killed or electrocuted, or they were shooting near their ears, and they had to live in the same room where their toilet was. So I'm staying in touch with those people, but they are deeply traumatized, and it's still difficult for them to speak of those things. So once they are able to speak, we will hear of those atrocities. So I also have the experience of being interrogated by the enemy, and also they were trying to encourage me to collaborate with them. They wanted me to do some SMM for them, to be their Instagram account manager, but somehow I managed to refuse. And at some point, my friends and I were able to leave the city. It was the right decision. If you spent another week there, I would not be able to sit with you here. Okay, so dear colleagues, you have a chance to ask any questions. Please make sure that your questions are correct.
Glad that you're here.
Just a second, we'll use a translator. Yes, please.
Добрий день. Мене звати Christopher. Дуже приємно. First off, I'm glad that you're here, and I'm glad you're okay. I know it's going to be a long road back. Your comment about how they tried to get you to collaborate is very interesting, because I know they
Just
did
a
this.
second, sorry. У вас нема перекладу.
Так, я в принципі розумію.
Якщо можна, хтось з нашої технічної команди підійдіть і допоможіть, будь ласка, налаштувати.
Все добре?
Зараз.
Все працює.
Okay, so about collaboration, you said that they did something I noticed that happened in Kherson several times, where they tried, if they couldn't control you, they tried to make you collaborate, which would compromise you. How common did you see that with your friends or your neighbors? Was this something that you saw frequently?
Yes, these stories are very numerous. And some people were not ready for the contacts. And again, while I was staying in the city, the Russians were trying to find some ways to persuade people. So one way to proceed was to persuade people to collaborate. Another way to proceed was to torture a person so that the person is not ready to communicate. So one option was getting a person who is ready to collaborate Another option is to get a person who is frightened so much that they are not active anymore. And if the person still remained active, they were killed. One neighbor was apprehended for the fact that he had a Ukrainian flag and was listening to Ukrainian music. So he spent 1 month in the cellar, and then they brought him to Oleshki, wearing the same robe that he was wearing at home when he was apprehended. And his leg was shot. Any other questions to our guests, dear colleagues? Maybe you will also want to communicate with them after the air. I'm grateful to our guests. Thank you for sharing your story. Thank you for your patriotism. Thanks to people like you, we are becoming closer to victory with each coming day. I'm joining the round of applause. Ukrineinform is going to continue its work on Monday. We are working on the announcements, and glory to Ukraine.